Hello, everyone, and welcome to the virtual Heller Center Salon Series. My name is Rhonda Goodman-Gagan, and I'm the curator at the UCCS Heller Center for Arts and Humanities. Tonight is the final program in our Spring 2021 Salon Series. We are broadcasting live from the Heller Center, and as I said in our 3 previous programs, we are sorry that you cannot be here with us. We're almost there, everyone, and we must hold on a bit longer. And while we cannot wait to have you back walking the Heller grounds and enjoying views of Pikes Peak and Eagle Rock, for now, these programs will remain virtual to keep everyone safe. For those of you for whom this is your first Heller program, I would like to offer some background before introducing tonight's speaker. The Heller Center for Arts and Humanities has been part of the UCCS campus since 1999. The 34-acre property was once the home of Larry and Dorothy Heller, a well-known socialite couple who lived in Colorado Springs in the mid-20th century. Larry was a well-known local and regional artist. Dorothy was one of the first women to work for the Colorado Springs Police Department. When she died in 1999, she donated her open space, the 3 structures on the site, a sizable art collection, and a wealth of historic artifacts to the university to foster interdisciplinary collaboration between the arts, humanities, and social sciences among students, faculty, staff, and local residents. We here at the Heller Center want to thank Event Services for working with us to stream tonight's program. And although this is our final salon of the season, we still have one more program. The Heller Center and the Department of English welcomes Professor Christine Stewart Nunez as the Spring 2021 Heller Fellow in residence April 19th through 24th. She's Professor of English at South Dakota State University, and she's the Poet Laureate for the entire state. Her public lecture will be 2 weeks from tonight, April 22nd. Please go to heller.uccs.edu for more information. Now, tonight's speaker. Max Shulman is Assistant Professor of Theater in the Department of Visual and Performing Arts. He received his undergraduate from Northwestern University, his master's from Hunter College, and his doctorate from Tufts University. His area of expertise is 19th and early 20th century American theater with a focus on national identity. His other research interests include radio drama, vaudeville, political theater, and Yiddish theater. Since coming to UCCS in 2016, his teaching has engaged with both Western and Eastern performance traditions, especially in the theaters of Japan and India. He is the director of the Homefront Theater Project that creates performance events around issues affecting our veteran and active duty communities. His research has been published in Modern Drama, Theater Topics, Theater Annual, and Studies in American Jewish Theater. He is co-editor of the recent collection of essays, Performing the Progressive Era, Immigration, Nationalism, and Urban Life, published by the University of Iowa Press in 2019. His forthcoming book, The American Pipe Dream, Performance of Drug Addiction, 1890 to 1940, will also be published by the University of Iowa Press. His topic tonight is Cab Calloway and the Jive Drug. Now tonight's program will work as follows. Professor Shulman will talk for 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. And we ask that you submit your questions through the chat function located at the bottom of your screen. So for now, Dr. Max Shulman.
Thank you, Rhonda. It is so wonderful to be here, and I want to thank the Heller Center for inviting me. It's so great to be on the grounds and to be part of this salon. Hi, everybody out there. I wish you were here with me, but we will, as Rhonda said, we will get by. So as Rhonda noted, the forthcoming book I have, The American Pipe Dream, looks at the representational history of drug addiction. It asks questions about how we have formulated the image of the drug addict in the American imagination, what the addict has meant to our culture over the last 100 years, and particularly it looks at the kind of origins of that relationship between the U.S. and drug use or drug addiction. Now, I want to focus on a particular chapter and one particular case study today. We're going to start by watching a video, listening to a song. So in the video you see, you may notice there's a lot of slang being used. Words you may be familiar with, words you may not. Let's do this. If you hear any of the slang, if you think you know what it means, write it in the chat, and let's see what you come up with. So I will let my technical person take it away.
In 1958.
Hey folks, here's a story about Minnie the Moocher. She was a low-down, hoochie-coocher. She was the roughest, toughest frail. Minnie had a heart as big as a whale. Heidi, 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 ho! Heidi, 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 ho! Eddie, 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 Eddie! Eddie, 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 Eddie! Whoa! Heidi, 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 ho! Heidi, 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 ho! He gave her his townhouse and his racing horses. Each meal she ate was a dozen courses. Had $1 million for the nickels and dimes. She sat around and counted them all 1,000,000 times. Howdy, 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 howdy. Howdy, 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 howdy. Howdy, 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 ho. Howdy, 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 ho. Scoodly-boo, scoodly-boo, scoodly-boo-doo-doo-doo-doo. Poor man, poor man. You win.
So that was Cab Calloway, the band leader at Harlem's hottest nightclub, the Cotton Club, which he took over from Duke Ellington in 1929 at the age of 21. In the late 1920s and 1930s, Cab Calloway was one of the most famous African-American performers in the country, known in particular for his 10-song cycle about Minnie the Moocher and her boyfriend, Smokey Joe. You just heard the first song in that cycle. Though located in Harlem, the Cotton Club featured black performers in front of a whites-only audience. It was perhaps the most famous cabaret during a period that Langston Hughes referred to as the Negro Vogue. At that time, African-American neighborhoods around the country were invaded by middle and upper-class whites at night, seeking entertainment, music, bootleg liquor, because it was prohibition, and narcotics, among other experiences. Key to our discussion today is that the Negro Vogue involved the suturing together of African-American culture, jazz culture, and drug culture in the public's mind, though they are all separate and none of them are monolithic. There was a synonymousness in which the experience of one of these cultures meant in the public's mind the exposure to all three. The result was a fusion or imbrication of these three cultures into a cultural behavioral, and stylistic category that I refer to as JIVE. Fittingly, in the 1930s, you could talk, play, and smoke JIVE. My interest here is how different audiences experience JIVE as a style, a language, a set of behaviors, an ideology, and a way of being. Now, the cabarets were JIVE hubs, and Calloway in particular was a JIVE demagogue. Obviously, slang is a huge part of his act. You heard it in the song. I don't know if you caught any of it, but a frail is a girl. Cokey is a cocaine user. Kick the gong around is to hit a gong, calling for another pipe in an opium den. I wonder if any of you caught those. It was a secret language of drug culture that Calloway peddled to his audience. Each song added to the last, culminating eventually in Calloway's Hipster's Dictionary that he published in 1939. These slang terms semantically communicate the drug underworld. Now, Calloway's song cycle created a jive mythology. Minnie and Joe represented romanticized versions of drug addiction and the fantastical world that addicts inhabited. They assumed positions of royalty, matched by the King and Queen of Sweden and the Prince of Wales. Part of the enjoyment was imagining European royalty as secretly slumming. The interactions further hint at the potential of interracial and cross-class desire that permeated the jazz club and were a significant part of the slumming experience. Calloway's line about the King of Sweden giving Minnie things that she was needing can be read euphemistically as a commentary on the practice of keeping African-American women as mistresses at the time and the economy of such arrangements. Calloway exaggerates the price of such pleasures to include a diamond car and a platinum wheel. Experiencing Calloway singing these songs enhanced these inferences. David Savrin notes that jazz was a partly improvisatory practice that happens in the space between performer and spectator. At the Cotton Club, there was no explicit demarcation between the performance and the audience. Not surprisingly, the term floor show, as something that happens in and amongst the spectators, comes into usage in 1927 to refer to cabaret entertainment. The floor show could momentarily evaporate the standard limitations on cross-racial interaction by creating forms of intimacy. Dancing, laughing, singing along, or repeating Calloway's turns of phrase were ways to enact this abandonment of racial boundaries. You heard the band repeating Calloway's scat choruses when he performed live. It was the audience who picked up those moments and tried to repeat what he said. In this environment, Calloway was known not just to sing about his characters, but to embody them. As early as 1931, Calloway performed his signature drug songs using a backdrop that depicted an opium den or Chinese coke hangout. These performances occasionally employed extras who lounged in bunks, smoking pipes. Calloway often dressed to resemble the characters in his songs. He would change from his trademark white tails into a crumpled dark suit and beaten fedora, in which critics reported that he gives a convincing impersonation of a drug addict. This impersonation involved what was described as epileptic contortions, as well as miming the snorting of cocaine, rubbing his nose, and physical twitching. Smokey Joe became a kind of alter ego for Calloway, and Minnie became his imagined love interest. In the 1945 film Heidi Ho, Calloway played himself, but with Minnie as his lover. In this, Calloway served as an agent of cultural transference. He was a medium through which audiences could experience a forbidden world. Calloway moved in and out of being the object of the audience's fascination and communicating a jive underworld from a removed position of narrator. At the same time, Calloway's carefully designed persona projected him as a protective shield against the real-life infiltration of these figures into the performance space. He was the tour guide, singing in the song Minnie the Moocher's Wedding Day, "Oh, let me take you down," to see them kick the gong around. When not in costume as his characters, his gleaming white tuxedo, flawless grooming, light skin, and inviting grin assured the Cotton Club's white audience that he was not the thing he represented. Calloway may have been a playboy, but not a criminal or an addict. He played upon his audience's desire for experiential freedoms, using the frame of the cabaret, the charged sound of jazz, and the exhilarating danger of drug use to trouble and dissolve the limitations traditionally placed on those desires. This expression of jive, however, was not only for the white-dominated market of the Cotton Club. So now, I'd like to look at Calloway from another angle and play another song. This time, I'm sorry to say, there's no video, it's just the tune. So here we're going to listen to part of, I might cut it off, Cab Calloway's tune, Zazoo Zaz.
A very entrancing phrase. It will put you in a daze. To me it don't mean a thing, but it's got a very peculiar swing. Zazoo, 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 zazoo. Zazoo Zaz was handed down from a bloke down in Chinatown. It seems his name was Smokey Joe, and he used to hidey ho. Zazoo, 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 zaz. Zazoo, zazoo, zaz. Zazoo, zazoo, zaz. Zazoo, zaz. Zazoo, zazoo, zazoo. Zazoo, 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 zazoo. When Smokey Joe came into town and he kicked on the round, any place that he would go, beneath the moocher she would sure to go with her zazoo zay, and who's zazoo 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 zazoo. It makes no difference where you go. There's one thing that they sure do know. There's no need for them to be blue, 'cause Zazoo Zaz will always see them through. Zazoo Zazoo Zaz. Zazoo 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 Zaz. Zazoo 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 Zaz. Zazoo Zazoo.
So here, I would like to look closely at Calloway's use of scat, and to argue that Calloway's performances promoted a kind of African-American autonomy and subversive expression through a celebration of drug culture and the figure of the addict, all through the aesthetics of jive. Now, the craze for scat singing, and that's, if you don't know what scat is, that song was scat heavy. It's when you use sounds instead of words, almost like an instrument. The craze for scat singing originated with Louis Armstrong's recording of the Heebie-Jeebies in the late 1920s. Armstrong, like Calloway, linked scat singing and drug use early on, imagining it as an expression of jive culture. In one of his earliest recorded scat songs, Sweet Sue, Just You, from 1933, Armstrong tells his audience that the scat singing of his saxophonist is a viper's language, which he then translates for the listener. A viper was a reefer smoker. Mez Mesro, who was a jazz musician and drug dealer to Harlem's jazz communities for years, reports that many of his customers memorized passages of Armstrong's scat singing, and before long, the lines became a form of street greeting among the initiated. Calloway was just as famous for his scatting, known as the Heidi-Ho Man because of that first song we listened to, and he too linked scat to the drug experience. Formulated in the moment as a completely figurative language, scatting enacts a practice that Zora Neale Hurston identifies as liquefying the words, which she believes is an ingrained element of African American vocal expression, especially in music. Scatting is also an extension of Henry Louis Gates' conception of signifying as an innate aspect of African American expression and culture. He puts in there things like playing the dozens and louding or loud talking. Slang is part of that as well. Signifying was a subversive and expressive practice of repetition and revision, inherited in many ways from African culture. Unlike a double entendre that can be locked down, scat remains an implication, refusing any formal exegesis. Calloway disrupts any clear division between his words and choruses of scat singing by flowing between the two, dissolving his language into rapid onomatopoeia of sounds. The scatted sounds engulf and explode the clear meaning of the verse as he suddenly shifts between them. By doing so, Calloway seems to express new feelings, ideas, and experiences, ones that he can only express through sound and movement. I envision this as an act of self-affirmation. The scholar Eric Lott sees the grinding voice of the blues singer Howlin' Wolf and the power behind the air pushed through Armstrong's trumpet as statements of empowered identity and simultaneously the source of that identity. Some found this same thing in Calloway's stage performances. An article from the Afro-American notes, both in his manner of singing and his gyrations on the floor, he's unstudied and wholly spontaneous, the natural expression of his exuberant vitality and innate sense of rhythm. Calloway's soaring tenor, full-bodied howls, and rapid scat solos that would exhaust, if not tongue-tie, a normal person, all manifest and proclaim extraordinary self-control. Calloway's scat singing does not just embody the indescribable drug experience, but celebrates jive as a source of African-American subjecthood. In the tradition of signifying, Calloway's scatting carries multiple and ambiguous potential meanings. The phrase zazuzaz itself can be the narcotic substance, which will put you in a daze and which will chase the blues away, and yet it is also the effect of the drug in its very peculiar swing. The performance of rapid scatting of the chorus also limbs the indescribable experience of being stoned. At the same time, the zazuzaz is something that Minnie and Joe independently possess. It is her zazuzaz that keeps her afloat, no matter where she goes. It's a survival tool, handed down, as Calloway says, through initiation, that enables the transcendence of challenging environments. Calloway's energized singing not only embodies that transcendence, but celebrates it. Fred Modem, the jazz scholar, conceives of jazz performance as part of a continual process of reinvention by African Americans. He clarifies that scat singing in particular is a passionate response to passionate utterance. Horn, voice, horn over percussion. A protest, an objection, the deconstruction and reconstruction, the improvisational recording and revaluation of value, the theory of value, of the theories of value. Through coordinated dance, music, and vocalization, Calloway offered a kind of kinesthetic expression of the indefinable highs and lows of the Black experience. His passionate utterances of soaring scatting eschewed subjection in their improvisational liveness that did not fit in to the whitewashed milieu of the Cotton Club, the bourgeois society of Harlem's intelligentsia, and the Anglo-Puritanism of the dominant US culture. Through the demonstration of another way of being, Calloway challenges the schemas of individual and communal valuation that those cultural forces promoted. He uses jive expression as a defense for a jive existence. In this, Calloway joined a group of writers and artists of the Harlem Renaissance known as the Cabaret School of thinkers, people like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Claude McKay. These thinkers defended Black cabaret culture against the onslaught of bourgeois social ascension promoted by many in the African American community at the time, who saw the adoption of traditional middle-class American values of refinement and family unity as crucial for the ascension of the African American in the country. Performers such as Calloway enacted a radical break from and rebellion against the politics of what is called normative uplift, rejecting desire for class ascension and the promotion of traditional Western aesthetics in art. In this way, jive culture served as a location of social and subjective expansion. It created a legitimate and diverse ways of being. Thus, summarizing, Calloway represents and joins a number of African American artists and creators of the 1920s and 30s who sought new ways of embodying the ontological position of Blackness that countered not only white hegemony, but the racial uplift ideologies of the Harlem Renaissance. Drug culture and the drug addict, as aspects of jive, provided Calloway a way to model and communicate this other way of being and surviving. So I'll stop there, but I will note that in the book, I try to explore how these performances of jazz and their reception echo throughout the 20th century. In particular, I'm interested in how they factor into the development of our contemporary drug laws that unfairly target African Americans and have tragically decimated African American communities. So I look forward to your questions and comments, your thoughts about Cab Calloway or about the larger book in general. So if you have any questions, write them in. Oh, sorry, that's you.
Hello, my name is Hamish Shepard. I am the Student Programming Assistant at the Heller Center, and I am going to be reading your questions for the speaker. Please, when you are submitting them into the chat, make sure that they are to everyone. We do have one from Rhonda. Speaking of cultural transcendence, to what extent would white audiences have understood the slang, Calloway delivered in his songs? Did they understand he was singing / performing a drug addict, as a drug addict?
That's great, yeah. You know, one of the main things he does is he markets that slang. So it was about experiencing the other world without ever really experiencing it. So the U.S. has a long tradition of what's called slumming. In the 1890s and 1900s, you could go downtown, and typically this was in Chinatowns. You could pay a cop or you could pay a tour guide to walk you through the kind of darker areas of Chinatown. This was something that middle-class people did a lot too. It was exciting, but it was also to view how the other half lived. I think what you have when you get to Calloway's time is not that same kind of formalized slumming, but by going into Harlem, crossing into these areas, I think white audiences, for the most part, wanted to experience the other side of things. And so Calloway becomes, you know, Calloway becomes a way to do that. The theater it always has these kind of things because performance like this offers you safety. The thing you're seeing is not really the thing that is dangerous. And the conventions of the theater mean that you are separated from this thing for the most part, and you get to view it. So Calloway was kind of offering them a peek at something. I think they understood the slang. It was about getting hip. This was about getting hip to a certain thing. Now, I think, on the other hand, and you know, white audiences are not monolithic or hegemonic entirely. On the other hand, there are the actual drug users who understood what Calloway was saying in a whole different way, in an embodied way. Slang in drug subcultures, there's a reason that drug subcultures, and really subcultures themselves, always have slang. They separate them, and there's an aspect of pride of being able to express yourself in something that defines you. It's also a defense mechanism. Those who can speak the speak, they're safe to talk to. But those who don't know the language, you have to avoid. So they could probably, those who are actually initiated, I don't really talk about drug cultures in this talk, but likely enjoyed Calloway for a whole different reason, which is that they were really in on the joke. They were initiated, yeah.
So, joke. Question here from Alex. Does your book delve into how jive evolved and was used and or exploited by the counterculture of the 70s? Do you believe artists, maybe like Janis Joplin, were taking some of the influences of Calloway, and do you still see influences today?
That's so great. What a great question. Yes. Certainly that slang carries over, and there's slang that Calloway is promoting that still works today. And in fact, some of Calloway's slang from the 1920s and 30s dates back to the 1900s. So it really carries over. Drug slang always carries over, and we can talk about that. My book goes up to 1940, but I do talk about the echoes of how, especially beat poets who were writing in the 1950s, took to both drug use and jazz, if you know the work of a lot of the beat poets, both drug use and jazz, as a kind of new expression, an engagement with African American culture as a way of really touching America, and breaking out of kind of what they saw as the bonds that had been placed on them. The 1960s isn't, we always forget the Beats were writing in the 1950s, even though they were primarily popular in the 1960s. So they become definitive of the 1960s. So those beat poets were using that language, directly from the 30s and 40s. Part of the difference is that when you get into the 40s and 50s, the kind of jazz that Calloway played changes. Not that Calloway played, but jazz changes. It's the invention of bop. And bop is what we think of today when we think of jazz. It's those extraordinary, complicated solos. It's people like Miles Davis, John Coltrane. It's all the major figures, Dizzy Gillespie, that we think of. It's not the dancing jazz that we think of when we think of Duke Ellington necessarily, or Cab Calloway certainly, who is especially commercial. So the music changes, but some of the energy, especially when white artists start to engage with it, do carry over. And so I think it'd be hard to lock that in exactly, but I think you could look at someone like Janis Joplin and imagine that she's certainly being influenced by some of the beat culture that becomes hippie culture, that becomes yippie culture, that becomes counterculture, that is all engaged. The hippies do start using drugs since the Negro Vogue. It's the hippies who are the first to use drugs in a fun way. Between the Negro Vogue and hippies, it's all darkness. It's all, don't do that, you'll become an addict and kill yourself immediately, right? It becomes a very dark time. So there is the sense that both of them are looking to addiction and drug use as not addiction, but drug use as a kind of another way of being and functioning, and as a rebellion and a subversion. So I think there's probably a connection, yeah.
Awesome. So the next question kind of leans off of what you were starting with, could you say a bit more about the way the larger project links this earlier material with the later developments? For example, the war on drugs. Your last mention of the connection left me curious for more.
Totally, yeah. So if you look at something like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, her recent book, one of the main arguments she makes is that the drug laws in this country that are part of the war on drugs that came out of the Nixon administration were enhanced by the Reagan administration, and to be honest, were bolstered by the Clinton administration, including by then Senator Biden. That those laws in their design have decimated African American communities. They were aimed at the controlling of those communities. They were based on reports, media barrages about things like marijuana and crack smoking and cocaine addiction, specifically in black and brown communities. She talks about that media explosion. She also talks about some of the entertainment that helped essentially create a drug scare in the 1980s. She looks at things like, in the 90s, she looks at things like films like New Jack City, Boys in the Hood, Menace to Society, which did not mean to do this, but were interpreted very often as evidence of a horrific crack cocaine problem that turned mostly black bodies kind of into unsalvageable people. What I try to do in the book is point out that I can historicize those expectations further, that they don't just date back to the 1980s and 1990s, they date back to the 1920s and 1930s. And even, to be honest, that's in entertainment. Within news reporting, they date back to the 1900s. That the belief that African American and Latin American communities were susceptible to drugs, that drugs had a pronounced effect upon them, those racist conceptions of drug use go 100 years back. And so part of what I do in the book is try to demonstrate those links. Essentially what happens in drug scares is whatever the stereotypes of a marginalized community are to begin with, the thought is that when they use drugs, all of those stereotypes become enhanced to like a 15. They get blown out of proportion. So if there is a fear of miscegenation in the 1920s and 30s, which means racial mixing, which means that if there is a fear that African American men desire white women, then when they are on drugs, they become savage rapists. And I'm not. It's important to say that I'm almost quoting when I say that. And so part of what I do is trace not only the representational practice that feeds those stereotypes, but also how they feed early drug laws. So the first drug czar in the United States, a position that I think we still have, was a guy named Henry Anslinger. He invented the position essentially, and he was in that position for 30 years. And I am a firm proponent of the idea that no government official should be in their position for 30 years. Because what he did was he created a drug scare around non-white people using marijuana in order to create the Bureau of Narcotics and in order to create laws that specifically targeted those people. The drug laws we have today are based on those laws. And he spent 30 years with an unbelievable budget promoting a fallacy. It is really important to me, and I do this in the book, and I'm working from national data to point out that there has never been a moment in this nation's history where there have been more black drug users in this country than white. The dominant drug user in this country today and the dominant drug user in this country always has been white people. And the dominant drug dealer in this country has been and always has been white people. That is a surprise to a lot of people. And I think especially at the time Michelle Alexander is writing, I'm sort of paraphrasing, but it got to the point that you couldn't imagine that a drug user was anything other than non-white. That is a media product that is not based in any reality.
Just one comment on that from me. It's hard for someone to be more when they're only 69. They're like 12% of the population.
Right.
It's we have a comment of, this reminds me of current hip hop songs that use code words to get on the radio, sneaking in either drug or sex slang words past broadcast standards. I'm thinking of the words skeet, skeet, skeet in the song Window to the Wall. How I can't believe this song is widely played on the radio, still widely played on the radio.
Yeah. There's also, and this is something I just touch on, but I don't go deeply into in the book. I don't know that I can argue that the use of slang or the embrasure of drug culture today has the same kind of resonance that Calloway had. I really think Calloway's using drug culture to express something. To express something subversive that isn't even necessarily about drugs. It's about being different, living a different life, having a different way of being, right? I don't know. There's an embrasure of hip hop that we see where there is an embrasure of drug use and slang, certainly as a way but drug use as an form of inspiration, which dates back to the early 1800s, and a kind of counterculture way of life. I will say hip hop has always been aware of the problems, of the political problems that exist amongst the drug laws. In the book, I think I end the chapter by quoting Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five's song White Lines, where I won't remember it and I wouldn't do it service if I did, but he essentially says, a kid on the street gets arrested, does 3 years, a banker gets arrested with 5 kilos, does a week and gets out. And that's how it goes, right? And so that's 1981, I think. So there's a long hip hop in its birth has an awareness of how drugs factor into that culture.
Then from Joshua, we have Max. What about Calloway's other drug alter, the Reefer Man?
Thanks for bringing up the Reefer Man. Yeah, I don't really know what to say about it except to point out that the reason I study Calloway is because I should point this out. Lots of jazz musicians in the period sang drug songs. I mean, Louis Armstrong, Fats Waller, Benny Goodman had weed songs. Like Benny Goodman, happy little Benny Goodman with his clarinet, had marijuana references in his songs, mostly because they were popular. I don't think he indulged. And in fact, Calloway didn't indulge either, which is interesting, where Armstrong did. And I'd love to talk about that too. The reason I study Calloway is because he had so many drug songs. He founded his career on drug songs. And I actually have a list. So if you're interested. Minnie the Moocher's Wedding Day, Kicking the Gong Around, Zazu Zaz, Mr. Pagnini, Swing for Minnie, The Ghost of Smokey Joe, Minnie's a Hepcat Now, and then these are non-Minnie songs, The Viper's Drag, Reefer Man, The Man from Harlem, The Old Man from the Mountain, which has an insane history if anybody's interested, and We Go Well Together. Those are all drug songs he recorded and really built his career on them. So that's why I look at him, because I think he's the best case study for it. But again, you could apply a lot of what I say about how he functions in two different ways for different audiences about a lot of different musicians. Yeah. But the Reefer Man is great. Yeah.
Then we have a question from Alex. When does the book come out?
Oh, Alex. Thanks, Alex. The book should, if everything goes well, it's been pushed back. It's been delayed because of COVID. Scholarly publishing, some of you, my colleagues out there know, is glacial in how slow it moves. It's even more glacial right now. It probably should have been out, but I'm hoping for the fall if all goes well, this coming fall. Yeah.
If this thing would go up like I wanted to. Thank you. So we have a question from Rob. You speak of a darkness at this time, and of course after, with the war on drugs. With his media empire, Hearst certainly contributed to this. How much of this darkness was Hearst creating it, and how much was Hearst just capitalizing on already commonly held beliefs about drug culture?
Hearst, that's a great comment. Hearst was certainly fueling a lot of the drug scare in the period. He had a writer named Winifred Black, who is quite famous, really well known in the period, who wrote enough caustic drug editorials and reports that they were actually then combined into a book you could buy. And I'm blanking on the name right now. I think it's called The Living Dead. I think. By Winifred Black, I think that's what it's called, where she was really, especially in Hearst magazines, the face of drug terror. of the idea that we should be horrified and terrified that drugs are coming into our communities, that they are ruining our children, that this actually comes from temperance drama earlier, which is about drinking, that you take one sip, you take one toke, you take one shot, you immediately become an addict and kind of lose your mind. There's no going back. And Hearst, especially within his newspapers that of course were across the nation, published some of these some reports that targeted minoritized communities, that especially were about, you know, the cocaine use in the South, or the marijuana use of Mexican immigrants. But it's important to point out that it wasn't just Hearst. I mean, you find articles like this in the New York Times. You find articles like this just across reporting. But Hearst is an important figure in this. Yeah, I talk about Hearst in a couple places because he also, the first chapter of the book is about opium smoking and specifically with the Chinese immigrant and how opium smoking was sutured to conceptions of Chineseness in the nation. And Hearst, in his backing of the war in the Philippines and of the U.S.'s, I shouldn't say of the U.S.'s first act of empire, act of colonialism when they took over the Philippines, Hearst really backed that idea, and really backed the idea that we could go over and tame the savage. Drugs is interlaced into that conversation because the English are still importing opium all over the world. And because there was a plethora of opium and marijuana, hemp in the Philippines, and there was a fear that those drugs would infect the U.S. And so Hearst had to do this sort of balancing game, as did all the people who were promoting colonialism, which they did a balancing game of, we can go over there and tame them, but do not let them in here. May ring a bell for some people in the moment. It's not unlike what's going on right now. Not to be blasé, I apologize, but.
We have a question from Seth. In your book, do you specifically focus on individuals throughout the decades, or do you also incorporate other movements, organizations, and performances?
The chapters are broken up. So I'll put it. I should. In my archival research, so in spending my time searching for references to drug use in this period, 1890s to 1940, I found about 160 plays, about 60 movies, and about 30 cabaret and vaudeville acts. So that amounts to close to 200 documents, however you want to put them, or options to study that I had to organize to try to understand the different ways that addiction was being represented. And I had to take this massive amount and then figure out how I was going to talk about it. What's fascinating is most of those are things that very few scholars have ever talked about, and most people have never heard of. It's not all reefer madness. It's plays that you would never produce today that were popular. It's acts that died with the person who did them. It's jazz tunes. It's films that are lost, or you could have to go to the Library of Congress to view things like that. The way I separate the book out is I spend the first chapter talking about opium smoking, and primarily plays about opium smoking, because there was a whole genre that I call the opium den drama that was really popular between about 1890 and 1920. And that played all over the country, and they always featured scenes in opium dens, usually with captured women, and they'd have to save them and things like that. There are also movies that are essentially based on the same idea. The second chapter is about a small set of plays that that connect drug use to doctors, and a promotion in the period that doctors were responsible for the drug habit in the country. So I really look at how the formation of what it meant to be a doctor is actually interlaced with what it meant to be a drug addict and how they're connected to each other. And when that break occurs, when do we start thinking of doctors as saints who save everybody, and what happened before then? There's the chapter on JIVE. There's a chapter on so most of those chapters talk about multiple plays or multiple individual performers. I have 2 chapters that talk about one figure, and that's the CALLOWAY chapter, where I'm talking about jazz, but I'm using Calloway. And then there's one on the comic dope fiend, which was this, it's where the book research started. It's on this guy named Junie McCree. Junie McCree was a vaudeville performer who in 1900, still blows my mind. In 1900, he was famous for going on the vaudeville stage, which the vaudeville stage was like for working class families and middle class families. You took your family there. He would go on stage and do a dope fiend act, where he sort of looked like a kind of like saloon poet, and he would do all this slang. It's actually related to Calloway, and he would pretend to be an opium smoking addict in like a zany scene in 1900. And so that gets its own chapter. And then the final chapter changes direction to look at the history of those few moments in which drug addiction or drug use is thought of as inspiratory. So that connection we think of between like doing drugs and creating great art, that dates back to about 1820. And I look at in the period where that shows up in the US and how it's represented. So what does it mean to be a man of genius who uses cocaine or smokes opium in order to enhance that genius? Where do we get that idea? And of course, we see that across popular culture today, including the jazz musicians of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. When we look at people like John Coltrane, Miles Davis. And then the final chapter for you theater historians out there, or not the final chapter, but the conclusion, I look at Long Day's Journey into Night by Eugene O'Neill. The reason I do that is because if you go up to a theater professor and you say, drug addiction in the theater, they will go, Long Day's Journey into Night. It's the one reference point. And it was written in 1940, right 1941, right where my study ends. And so I save it for the ending, in part to say it is a brilliant play, but it really does not represent how drug addiction has been perceived or performed over the last 100 years. It's an anomaly, a brilliant, extraordinary anomaly, but it is an anomaly as opposed to the one that we should all be quoting. Yeah. Thanks, Seth. I think I know who that Seth is.
We have another question from Rhonda. Did all jazz singers use scat to describe the drug experience? How would Ella Fitzgerald fit into this?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the answer is no. I don't claim, and I cannot claim, that every time someone is using scat, it is inevitably linked to drug use. I don't think it is. I think scat is multifarious, dependent on the artist. I think it can express all types of things. I think scat very often functions as a deep-seated spiritual and embodied expression. I do think that, but it's really it's only in people like Calloway and Louis Armstrong, but it is at its origins. There are some ethnomusicologists who would probably disagree with me and say, no, you're missing some of the earlier examples, and they're probably right. But Louis Armstrong is the guy who popularized scat, and he did it in reference to drug use. Calloway popularized scat, and his songs are all drug use. It was reported that Calloway invented scat. It's not true, but in the late 1920s and 30s, newspapers were writing that he was the founder of scat. And you couldn't separate his work, his songs from his expression of drug use. So I don't think that all scat use is that. And I wouldn't even go so far as to say the true foundations of scat, which ethnomusicologists really think goes back to a foundation of African expression, of rhythm and sound, and of, as Zora Neale Hurston says, liquefying words. And that it is like Gates's version of signifying, which he dates back to the signifying monkey, which is an African tradition of wordplay. I think it starts there, but I think when it is advertised as part of the Negro Vogue, as part of that experience, as part of that jazz movement, I do think at its origins there, in that moment, it is linked to drug use.
So a question I have is, what would be like the biggest part of looking back towards what Calloway was doing? What's the biggest part to take into the modern context to be able to use now?
Ooh. Okay, that's a great question. And just as this chapter has two theses, I'm going to give you two answers. The way of reading Calloway and the way of reading the experience of Harlem as it was commercialized nationally, that has, I think, for the most part, been the dominant way that people have experienced his music and experienced that period of Harlem activity. And that's, again, it's not just Harlem, Brownsville and Chicago. The idea that, and we're really talking about dominant white culture. Going into African-American neighborhoods, there was the thought, there's a scholar named Shane Vogel who talks about this, and Shane Vogel argues that there was an imagination that African Americans kind of had a freedom of expression and a freedom of experience that middle class whites didn't have, and so they would cross into these other places in order to engage in that. It kind of freed them. They could go to the Cotton Club and they could dance like they couldn't dance elsewhere. They could sleep with who maybe they couldn't sleep with. They could do drugs. They could drink, things like that. That it was this site of freedom. But that they linked that freedom to a racist assumption about Black culture. And I think in many ways that still exists today. I think conceptions of African American culture as naturally sybaritic, naturally indulgent, or lacking self-control, I think those exist today. On the other hand, I think there's the other way of interpreting Calloway, which I think is a profound subversion of dominant culture in an expression of a way of being, and a specifically African-American way of being, one that I labeled JIVE, but that you could label lots of other things. But I label it, I use that term because it exists at that crossover, that I think in some version, in some sort, does still exist today in use. And there are people who are reading lots of different versions of African-American culture as that kind of subversive expression, as a refusal to be defined by a dominant culture and a refusal to accept bourgeois concepts, bourgeois visions of the way to be as acceptable. One of the things I don't talk about in this book is how I didn't talk about here is how other artists use the same conception, and you can see it throughout African American literature. I think the same kind of subversive activity. So what I try to offer in the book, because there's so much that I could talk about, is I try to offer different methodologies for looking at drug performance. Those are two of them. Looking at the commercialization and commodification of Black culture as it relates to drug use, and then looking at how African American culture within its culture used drug use as a different kind of expression. So I'm trying to offer essentially different analytical tools, and that's what I hope. The other, of course, is what somebody had asked about before, which is simply that these racist assumptions have major implications.
So our last question.
Oh God, I could do this all day.
And this is from the article, Literary Tropes of Male Addicts, Impotent, Effeminate, and Having a Queer Sexuality, same as stereotypes aimed at Asian men. Is that intentional?
Is that intentional? Intention is hard to prove. but it is not accidental, is what I would say. It's not by accident. So this is linking to some of the other work that I've done, where there is a history of representing the drug addict as either having a queered sexuality or having a kind of failed gender. When you think about the traditional binary of masculine expression, it is not new, but it is not accidental. I think it is a way of explaining addiction. To this day, we don't really know what causes addiction. We have theories, we have ideas. It's hard to clarify why someone becomes an addict. That has always been a problem. Addiction is so dangerous in culture because it's egalitarian. It doesn't matter if you're white, if you're black, if you're Latin. It doesn't matter if you're male, if you're female. It doesn't matter if you're gay or straight. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. Addiction can affect you. That has always been the fear and the problem. And so when you look at representations of addiction, what you're seeing is somebody trying to create a causality. Why did that person become an addict? Because they're not man enough. Why did that person become an addict? Because they weren't raised right. Why did that person become an addict? Because they're mixed race. So the history of addiction is really in many ways that. It is an attempt to create a causality for explaining away this incredibly complicated social condition. Social and medical condition. And so, tension is hard, but it is meaningful and it is not accidental.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shulman. And thank you very much for joining us tonight. And thank you for joining us for the entire Heller Salon series. Next fall, the Heller Salon series will go back to its regular spacing. One speaker will speak in the fall, one in the winter, and one right after spring break. Please take a look at our Facebook and our webpage for other programs coming up over the summer. And we hope that it will all be back on site. We really want that to happen. So until then, take care. Good luck with the rest of your semester, and we'll hope to see you soon. Good night.